December 20th, 1943. Somewhere over northern Germany, the winter sky was the color of ash. The sun hadn't broken through the clouds in days. The temperature outside the cockpit was 40 degrees below zero. Inside a battered Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress named Ye Olde Pub, 9 men fought to keep their machine alive. They were young, none older than 25. Their mission that morning had been simple: on paper bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, then return to England. It was the 14th mission of the 379th Bomb Group, based out of Kimbolton. For most, it was just another day in the long chain of air raids that had become routine over Europe. But nothing about this flight would be routine. Captain Charlie Brown, 21 years old, from West Virginia, had taken off at 8 a.m. with a formation of hundreds of bombers. This was his first mission as aircraft commander. He'd flown only a handful of sorties as co-pilot before. Now responsibility for 9 lives sat behind his oxygen mask. His crew called the plane the Pub. It was an old superstition: give your fortress a friendly name, make it feel alive. By the time they crossed the Dutch coast, anti-aircraft batteries had already spotted them. Flak began bursting in black clouds around the formation. Each explosion looked like a flower of smoke opening in the thin air. The vibration rattled the skin of the aircraft. Brown held the yoke steady. He could see the target ahead through a crack in the windshield. Frost Bremen. Columns of smoke rising from the factories, shimmering under sunlight. The bombardier toggled the release switch. 5,500-pound bombs fell from the bay. The formation turned for home. And then, everything went wrong. Flak tore through the Pub's right wing. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage. One piece ripped through the nose and shattered the plexiglass canopy. Another severed electrical wiring to the tail turret. Then came the fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving from 12 o'clock high. Brown shouted for the crew to stay tight. Machine guns opened up, 12 Browning 50s hammering at the sky. The formation scattered under the assault. Two bombers exploded almost immediately, fireballs rolling across the clouds. Another went into a flat spin, wings tearing away. Brown's right engine took a direct hit. Oil sprayed across the cowling. Then the number 4 engine died completely. Smoke filled the cabin. Within minutes, the Pub was isolated, limping alone through enemy territory. Brown tried to rejoin formation, but the other fortresses were gone, only vapor trails in the distance. Then another burst of flak hit from below. A 20mm shell exploded near the nose. The blast ripped open the fuselage between the radio room and the waist guns. The tail section trembled. The oxygen system ruptured. Temperatures inside dropped instantly. Sergeant Alex Yelisenko, the tail gunner, was hit in the leg. Blood froze on the floor before it pooled. The right waist gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly, his body thrown against the bulkhead. The top turret gunner was wounded, slumped against his controls. Brown's hands shook on the yoke. He was flying half-blind, one engine gone, the others running unevenly. The intercom was dead. He could barely hear the engines over the wind tearing through the holes in the fuselage. He looked back and saw daylight through the tail. There were holes big enough to crawl through. The skin of the bomber flapped like torn fabric in the SLIPSTREAM. At 26,000 feet, frost coated the inside of their masks. Blood froze before it could run. Every control felt like lead. Brown shouted to his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, to feather the dead propeller. Luke didn't respond. He was unconscious. For a moment, Brown thought everyone else might be dead too. The cockpit was silent except for the sound of air screaming through the broken panels. He considered turning the bomber toward the North Sea and bailing out. But then he heard movement from the waist section, somebody crawling forward. It was Sergeant Al Sadek, the ball turret gunner. His face was blue from the cold, blood frozen in his hair, but he was alive. "Captain," he shouted, his voice then through the intercom. "The tail's gone." "Eckenrode's gone? But the others? The others are hanging on." Brown realized he couldn't give up. If any of his men were still alive, he'd get them home. No matter what. Below, the German countryside rolled past fields dusted with snow, small villages, a river twisting like a silver vein. The bomber was losing altitude, barely holding 200 miles per hour. They were still more than 250 miles from the English Channel. And then, out of the haze, came more fighters. 5 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared from the clouds. Brown saw them immediately, dark crosses against the pale light. They lined up for another pass. The wounded gunners in the pub manned their weapons, weak but ready. The machine guns coughed to life, tracers arcing through the air. The fighters closed to within 200 yards. The first burst ripped across the left wing. One shell hit the number 2 engine, sending fire along the nacelle. The flight engineer, Bertrand Colombi, smothered the flames with a CU extinguisher. A second fighter came from 6 o'clock low directly behind them. The tail gunner fired a short burst. The German broke off, trailing smoke. Then, almost miraculously, the rest of the attackers pulled away. They'd seen enough. The B-17 looked like a corpse in the air. No need to waste more ammunition on a dead machine, but the pub didn't fall. It kept flying low, bleeding fuel, engines coughing but alive. Brown eased the yoke forward, bringing the bomber down to 10,000 feet. He was hoping to avoid the cold, maybe find thicker air for the damaged engines. He didn't know it yet, but the move would bring him directly into the path of a German airfield and a pilot who would change everything. At Giver Airfield, Lieutenant Franz Stigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 had just refueled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. He'd scored 22 victories so far, one more, and he'd earned the Knight's Cross. When the sirens sounded, ground crew pointed to the sky. A lone bomber, smoking heavily, was crossing low over the treetops. Stigler climbed into his cockpit. His mechanic helped strap him in. The Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine roared to life. He taxied to the runway, pushed the throttle forward, and lifted off into the cold air. From a distance, the B-17 looked dead. No formation, no escort, just a black silhouette dragging smoke. Easy prey. He climbed behind it, closing from the rear quarter. As he approached, he reached for the trigger. But then something made him stop. The closer he got, the more he saw. The tail gun was destroyed. No one inside moved. The stabilizer was shredded like torn paper. The fuselage was ripped open. He could see right through the aircraft. The dorsal turret was motionless. And through the side window, he saw faces, bloody, pale, half-conscious. Not soldiers in a fight, just boys, barely alive, trying to bring a broken machine home. Stigler eased off the throttle and let his Messerschmitt drift closer to the wounded bomber. The roar of the Daimler-Benz engine softened to a steady hum. He approached from the left side, careful not to spook whoever was still alive inside the B-17. The air was thin and trembling with wind. He could see the American machine shaking with every gust. He'd never seen a bomber in such a condition still flying. There were holes everywhere, dozens, maybe hundreds. One wing looked like lace. The tail section was held together by threads of torn metal. The rear gunner's position was shredded, blackened by fire. He moved closer. Now, just a few meters away, the two aircraft flew side by side, predator and prey, perfectly level. Through the shattered plexiglass nose, Stigler could see the pilot, a young American, eyes bloodshot, one hand gripping the yoke with white knuckles. The man looked half dead from exhaustion, his oxygen mask hanging around his neck. Brown saw him too. For a heartbeat, he froze. He'd expected a final attack. Instead, the German fighter stayed there, pacing them like a shadow. No gunfire, no movement. Just a man in another cockpit, studying him through the glass. Franz Stigler's finger rested on the trigger. One short burst, and he'd finished them. The kill would bring him his 23rd victory, a Knight's Cross, a medal, and promotion. Everything he'd fought for, but something inside him refused. His older brother, August, had been killed earlier in the war after bailing out over the Mediterranean. Franz had seen his parachute open, then burst into flame from an enemy fighter's cannon fire. He had sworn that if he ever saw a defenseless man in the sky, he would never pull the trigger. Now that oath came back with full weight. This American crew wasn't fighting. They were dying. He eased his Messerschmitt even closer, until he could see the bullet holes stitched across the B-17's fuselage like open wounds. Inside, one of the waist gunners lifted his head. He tried to reach for his weapon, but it hung useless, ammunition belt empty, mount twisted. The young man slumped forward again. Stigler saw his mouth move. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew what they were, a prayer. He slid his fighter beneath the bomber, checking the damage from below. The bomb bay doors were frozen open. Fuel poured in thin streams from punctured lines. The right landing gear was half deployed, stuck in mid-position. Every control surface was ripped or bent. It was a miracle the plane was still in the air. Stigler thought, if I shoot them down, it will be murder. And if he escorted them, he would risk his own life and his honor. Helping the enemy meant court-martial, execution, disgrace. Still, he made his choice. He pulled his Messerschmitt up again, aligning his wingtip barely 10 feet from the B-17's. Then he gestured. He pointed down, then to the west, the direction of the English Channel. A signal, away home. Inside Ewell Pub, Brown blinked in disbelief. The enemy pilot was signaling him, trying to guide them. The crew didn't understand at first. The engineer wanted to man the gun. Brown shouted, "No one fires." He kept his eyes on the German, trying to read his face. Stigler motioned again down and west. Brown nodded weakly. He pushed the throttles forward, as far as they'd go. The B-17 responded sluggishly, sinking lower over the snow-covered fields. Below, anti-aircraft batteries spotted them. German gunners along the coast opened fire, bright flashes against the clouds. Tracer rounds arced toward the sky. Stigler dropped below the bomber, placing himself directly between the flak and the Americans. He wagged his wings violently, signaling the batteries, "Don't shoot," from the ground. It looked like he was chasing them. The gunners held their fire for nearly 10 minutes. The two aircraft flew together, enemy and enemy allies, in silence. The bomber's engines sputtered, coughing black smoke. The fighter's yellow nose gleamed faintly in the sun. Inside the B-17, the crew stared through broken windows, watching the impossible unfold. One of them whispered, "Why isn't he killing us?" Brown didn't answer. He didn't know either. They crossed the German coastline at 5,000 feet. Below them, the North Sea stretched out like a field of steel. Wind whipped across the bomber's broken hull. The crew could see the channel ahead. Home was beyond that line of gray horizon. Stigler knew this was as far as he could go. He turned his head and looked directly into Brown's cockpit. For a moment, their eyes met. No radio, no words, just recognition between two men who had nothing left to prove. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Brown stared, frozen. Then, instinctively, he raised his own. A salute returned through cracked glass and blood-streaked gloves. Stigler broke away, rolling his Messerschmitt to the right, climbing back toward the clouds. The bomber kept going, crawling westward, leaving a trail of smoke across the empty sea. Brown watched him disappear into the sunlight and whispered, "I'll never forget that man." For the next hour, Ewell Pub limped home through freezing wind and static. The crew counted every mile, every heartbeat. Fuel was nearly gone. 2 engines ran rough, one dead, one barely alive. Brown guided the bomber lower, praying they'd reach England before the wings tore off. When they crossed the coastline near Norfolk, the radio finally crackled to life. A British radar station had picked them up one lone fortress. Returning late, they cleared a landing strip at RAF Seating. Brown dropped the landing gear. The right wheel jammed, half extended. He decided to risk it anyway. The bomber touched down hard. Metal screamed. Sparks trailed behind the wing. But somehow, impossibly, Ewell Pub rolled to a stop. When ground crews reached them, they stopped in shock. The fuselage looked like a sieve. There were 300 bullet holes counted in the first inspection. The tail was nearly severed, and yet all but one of the crew were alive. That night, after the medics cleared his crew, Brown sat alone in the debriefing tent. An officer handed him a form. List the cause of damage and describe engagement with enemy fighters. Brown hesitated. He stared at the paper for a long time, then wrote, attacked by fighters. Severely damaged. Escorted out of enemy territory by 1BF to 109. Did not fire. The officer frowned. Escorted? By a German? Brown said quietly, yes, sir. He could have killed us all. But he didn't. The officer looked at him, then tore the page off. Keep that to yourself, Captain. Nobody's going to believe it. Stigler landed at his base just before sunset. He taxied to the hangar, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. He knew what he had done. Helping the enemy was treason. He would tell no one. Not his commanding officer. Not his squadron mates. Not his family. That night in his journal, he wrote only one line. I could not shoot. I would not be a murderer. For decades, no one spoke about what had happened in that frozen sky over Germany. The war rolled on, devouring cities, generations, and memories. By the time it ended in 1945, the world was too busy counting the dead to remember the miracles. Both men, Brown and Stigler, went home carrying their secret like shrapnel lodged in the soul. Captain Charlie Brown left the service in 1945, 30 missions behind him. He had survived the impossible, but survival didn't feel like victory. He returned to West Virginia thin, quiet, and changed. People expected stories of heroism. He told them about the flak, about the noise, about the faces of the men who never came back. But he never spoke of the German. To talk about compassion in a war built on hate felt like betrayal. He filed the debriefing away in memory and never looked at it again. He finished college on the GI Bill, joined the Foreign Service, and eventually worked for the State Department. He traveled the world, representing the country that had once sent him into the sky to kill. He married, raised children, and grew older, his hair turning white while the photographs of his crew yellowed in frames. Once in a while, someone would ask him about the war. He'd smile politely and change the subject. But sometimes, late at night, he'd look at the moon and remember another pilot silhouetted against it, an enemy who had spared his life. Franz Stigler's war ended differently. He flew until the final days of the Reich, watching his world collapse piece by piece. By 1945, Germany was ash and rubble. He had lost friends, comrades, and the country he thought he knew. When the Americans occupied Bavaria, he surrendered quietly, walking away from the airfield that had once been his home. The new Germany had no place for fighter aces. He emigrated to Canada in 1953, carrying only a few photographs and his flight log. He became a mechanic, then a businessman, fixing engines and small aircraft for crop dusters. He never talked about the war. To his customers, he was just frank. They didn't know that he had once flown a Messerschmitt over Bremen. But at night, when he looked out at the prairie sky, he sometimes thought of a battered American bomber limping west of boys barely old enough to shave, flying a miracle through the smoke. He had never known their names. He'd never told anyone what he had done, because if anyone found out during the war, he would have been executed. And afterward, who would believe him? Who would believe that mercy had existed between enemies? By the 1980s, both men were old. Brown had retired to Florida. Stigler was living quietly in Vancouver. Nearly half a century had passed since the day they met in the sky. Then, in 1986, at a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group, someone asked Brown about his most memorable mission. He hesitated. Then, for the first time in 43 years, he told the story. He described the flak over Bremen, the engines dying, the crew bleeding, the fighter that appeared beside the man, the salute that had followed. When he finished, the room was silent. One of the other veterans said softly, "You should try to find him." Brown laughed. "Find who?" a German pilot from 1943. He's probably long gone, but that night the idea wouldn't leave his mind. He realized he didn't even know the man's name, just his face behind the canopy glass. Still, he began to look. He wrote to veterans associations in Germany, to Luftwaffe historians, to anyone who might know of a pilot who had escorted a B-17 instead of destroying it. Most letters came back unanswered. Some offered polite disbelief. Others dismissed it as a myth. But Brown didn't stop. Something inside him needed to know. Not for closure, but for gratitude. In January 1990, one of his letters reached the office of the German Fighter Pilots Association. They published a small notice in their newsletter, searching for Luftwaffe pilot who spared the crew of a B-17 over Bremen, December 1943. Thousands of former pilots read it. Most ignored it. But one man, now 75 years old, living in Canada, froze when he saw the words. Franz Stigler read the date, the place, the details, and whispered, "My God, it's them." He immediately wrote back. His letter began simply, "I was the one." He included the unit, the airfield, and small details no one else could have known: the frozen oxygen masks, the half-deployed landing gear, the salute. Brown received the letter 2 weeks later. He read it twice, then called his wife into the room. His hands shook so much he could barely hold the paper. The next day, he dialed the number at the bottom of the page. A voice answered in a thick German accent. "Hello." There was silence for a long moment. Then Brown said, "This is Charlie Brown, the pilot of you old pup." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Stigler said quietly, "My God, you made it home." Brown laughed through tears. "Because of you." They talked for hours. They compared memories, filled in the gaps, relived the cold, the noise, the fear. Both men cried more than once. At the end of the call, Brown said, "Franz, would you come to America? I'd like to meet you." 2 months later, in June 1990, at a small airport near Seattle, the two men met for the first time since that day in 1943. Brown was 70 years old, stooped but steady. Stigler wore a jacket with a small Luftwaffe pin still attached. When they saw each other across the tarmac, they didn't speak. They simply walked forward and embraced. It was not the handshake of enemies. It was the reunion of brothers. For the next 18 years, they were inseparable. They visited schools, airshows, and museums together, telling their story not as veterans but as witnesses to something larger. They appeared on television, always sitting side by side. Brown would say, "He was the enemy who became my friend," and Stigler would add, "No, we were never enemies." At one event, a reporter asked Stigler if he had ever regretted letting the bomber go. He paused, then said softly, "If I had shut them down, I would have destroyed myself. That day, I saved my soul." The story spread around the world. Historians confirmed the encounter through mission logs and combat reports. The two men became living proof that even in the darkest hours of human history, decency could survive. But neither sought fame. They just enjoyed the peace that had eluded them for half a century. They spent holidays together. Brown called him "my brother." Stigler called him Charlie. They laughed about the absurdity of it all, how a German fighter, ace, and an American bomber pilot had found each other again through a newspaper notice, and how both had spent 40 years thinking the other had died. In 2008, when Charlie Brown passed away at age 86, Stigler was heartbroken. He told friends, "I lost my brother, not by blood but by soul." Franz Stigler died a few months later. His family found beside his bed a framed photograph of the two of them standing together, Brown in his U.S. Air Force uniform, Stigler in his old flight jacket. Beneath it, a note written in shaky handwriting, "My brother, my friend, until we meet again." When they died, the newspapers called it a friendship born in war. But it was more than that. It was a quiet proof that even when the world goes insane, two people can still choose decency. That choice made in a frozen sky above Germany in December 1943 outlived both men, both armies, and even the war itself. Charlie Brown's daughter once said her father never talked about the medals he'd earned or the missions he'd flown, but he always talked about friends. On his desk, until the day he died, sat a small wooden model of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had carved it himself. On the underside of the wing, he'd written in tiny letters, "To the enemy who showed mercy." At his funeral, veterans from both sides of the Atlantic came, Americans in blue uniforms, Germans in gray. When the honor guard folded the flag, one of Stigler's friends stepped forward and placed a single white rose atop the coffin. No words were said. They didn't need to be. Everyone there understood. For Franz Stigler, the years after Brown's death were heavy. He kept flying small planes into his 80s, but he flew lower, slower, always with the horizon close. He once told a journalist, after Charlie died, the sky felt empty. He kept every letter they had exchanged, hundreds of pages written between 1990 and 2008, the last one, dated just weeks before Brown's death. Read, "When I saw your plane that day, I could not kill you. You were no longer my enemy. You were a man. I felt I was looking at myself. We were both just boys who wanted to go home." In one of their public talks, years before they passed, someone asked Brown what he thought the lesson of their story was. He looked at the crowd for a moment, then said, "People like to say war makes men brave. That's not true. War just gives you choices. You can become a monster, or you can stay human." That German pilot stayed human. Then he paused and added, "And because he did, I lived long enough to have children and grandchildren, and to stand here talking to you." The two men's story became a staple of military ethics classes, leadership seminars, and engineering schools around the world. Not because of strategy or tactics, but because of morality. Because in a world built on obedience, one man chose disobedience in the name of decency. At the German Air Force Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck, instructors still tell the story of Stigler's decision. At the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, cadets read it during officer training. The lesson is the same: technology wins wars. Humanity wins peace. The original B-17 Pub never flew again. After limping home that day, it was deemed too damaged to repair. Its fuselage was stripped for parts. Its engines were removed. The frame was scrapped in 1944. But in 2013, the commemorative Air Force built a replica, painted in the same markings: gray belly, olive drab upper surfaces, serial number 423167, on its nose. In white block letters, they painted the name Ye Olde Pub, and beneath it, a small inscription only visible up close: "To Franz Stigler, who chose honor over victory." Every year, the aircraft flies at airshows across the United States. Children point to the sky, watching a gray silhouette glide through sunlight. Most don't know the story, but those who do fall silent when they hear it, because in 1,000 retellings, it never loses its power. If you stand close enough to that plane when it lands, you can hear the engines idle down low and heavy. The same sound Charlie Brown once heard over Germany. The same sound that hummed between two men who should have killed each other but did in single quotes t. And if you listen past the noise of the crowd, you can almost imagine their voices. You made it home. Because of you, moral reflection or is remembered through numbers. Sorties flown, bombs dropped, tons of steel produced. But sometimes, the most powerful stories are not about destruction, they're about restraint. Franz Stigler had spent his entire career training to kill. And yet, in the moment of absolute power, he chose mercy. That act didn't win a battle. It didn't change the outcome of the war. But it changed what the war meant, because in that frozen December sky, the world saw what civilization is built on: not hatred, not victory, but the courage to see the enemy as human. Legacy. In 2013, Canadian historian Adam Makos published their story under the title A Higher Call. He interviewed both families, traced military records, even found the declassified mission logs. At the end of the book, he wrote, their friendship was not about forgiveness. It was about recognition that even when nations go mad, individuals can stay sane. Today, the story of the bomber that refused to die circulates across classrooms, YouTube documentaries, and veteran halls. Some call it a miracle, others a coincidence. But to those who have seen war, it's something deeper, a reminder that the smallest act of humanity can echo longer than any gunfire. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler now rest on opposite sides of the continent, one in Florida, one in British Columbia. But if you visit their graves on a quiet day, the same kind of winter wind passes over both. The same cold air that once froze inside a bomber's cockpit and whispered through the frame of a Messerschmitt, and maybe, somewhere above that wind, two old pilots are still flying, one in a battered B-17, the other close beside him in a yellow-nosed Bf-109, no shots fired, no orders given, just a shared horizon stretching west.